This is episode 127 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Let me tell you about one of my favorite sponsors, and that is Lucky Guy Bakery. Over at luckyguybakery.com, if really delicious, all-natural, handmade brownies sound like something you'd be into, well, this is the place for you. We're coming up on the holiday season, and I know a lot of you guys won't be traveling as much, probably as you did last year. Well, the brownies and treats over at Lucky Guy Bakery are the perfect gift idea. They come in really well-designed, handmade packaging, and each order has a handwritten note, which is a really nice personal touch that they do there at Lucky Guy Bakery. I could obviously go on and on about the flavors and tastes of the brownies. The new peanut butter bonanza bar is the most amazing peanut butter cookie bar that you will ever have. That is my Death to Tyrants guarantee. For those of you wondering if they have, something for your vegan or gluten-free friends, of course they do. Such a cool bakery. Handmade items, all-natural brownies, no preservatives ever. So many good flavors, such great packaging, such cool gift ideas, and they love this show. Let's give them some business. So go over to luckyguybakery.com and enter promo code DTTP at checkout for 20% off your order. It's an excellent product. They're great people. Their customer service is unparalleled, so go give them some support. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, now coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. So, in the news, as far as politics goes, there's basically one major thing going on right now. There's all kinds of offshoots, but it all has to do with the presidential election coming up here in a few weeks. And so we're going to talk some about that today. And when I love to talk politics of this sort, Daniel McCarthy, there's not a lot of guests better than this guy. I love hearing him on other podcasts. I love reading his work. Really good guy. And let's put it this way. I had a few connectivity issues with my new setup here in the new office. And Daniel was really patient and super cool throughout. And I think we finally got something on record here to give you guys. For those of you that aren't familiar with Modern Age, a conservative review, excellent journal. We discuss it at the end. I'm going to link to where you can get it in the show notes page. I highly recommend subscribing to it. And he used to be the editor over at American Conservative. I see his writings even in the New York Times. He does some of the reviews for the presidential and vice presidential debates. And the guy is really good. And so he's here to give his pitch on why libertarians should vote for Donald Trump. Now, I hope some of you didn't slam on your brakes or start yelling at your speakers right there. He's giving his fair and honest opinion on why libertarians should vote for Trump. And I know some of you guys don't vote. I know some of you are going to vote for Trump, and I bet a fraction of you that are in that camp aren't going to tell anyone, are you? And then, of course, I know a lot of you guys are also voting for Joe Jorgensen. But like I said, Daniel is here to make his case for Donald Trump and the importance of this particular election. And I don't want to waste your time telling you what we're going to talk about much further. Like I said, he used to be the editor over at American Conservative. He's now the editor at Modern Age, and he's super cool to be once again on the show today. Daniel McCarthy, welcome back. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, thanks, and it's a pleasure to join you.
Yes, sir. You are one of my favorite people to follow as far as politics go, and it does seem like you're published in quite a few outlets these days. How long have you been covering politics?
I've been in political journalism for about 20 years, going back to 2003 when I joined the American Conservative as a staff writer. And even before that, I was writing as a freelancer for places like BlueRockwell.com and also doing student journalism on the campus of Washington University in St. Louis.
Has the left become crazier in recent years than it was when you first started covering this stuff, or is that just something us young bucks seem to sense?
Well, back in 2003 and in general during the George W. Bush years, it was the neoconservatives who were the source of most of the mayhem besetting our country. The left was, it was terrible, it was rotten, it was already very bad during the Clinton years and during the George W. Bush years, but it didn't have the kind of death grip on our institutions that the left has now. The media was not quite as over the top in terms of its bias. The academy was not sort of fully not just controlled by the left, but sort of enforcing leftist dogma the way that it does today. And you didn't have the social media networks creating the kind of activist channels that allow the left to bully people today. And you didn't have the tech companies not only permitting, but of course encouraging this kind of left-wing activist bullying and mob mentality. So yeah, the left has become a lot worse, and it's really because the left has acquired a lot more power in the last 20 years.
When I get someone on like yourself, there's always all kinds of questions I want to ask. And largely, this will be about the presidential election. And so I guess I have to get to this one first. For years now, I've been voting since the year 2000. And every year I hear this is the most important election of all time. I will admit, though, for some reason, this one actually does feel that it actually might be at least the most important election of my lifetime. What does this upcoming presidential election represent to you?
It boils down to a choice between going back to control by the establishment with Joe Biden or going forward to an end to establishment power with Donald Trump. And we've seen, during this first term, Donald Trump was not as successful as we would have liked in terms of fighting against the deep state, in terms of setting a completely new direction in U.S. foreign policy and in domestic policy as well. He, found out that getting the reins of government is actually a much more difficult task than simply winning an election. You need the personnel who are able to implement the new policy ideas that you have. And you also have to, get a little bit of experience in just how things work and whether or not they're feasible. Now, after 4 years, Donald Trump has a really excellent personnel department, and he's starting to put in some really great people who've been nominated for ambassador to Germany, for example, ambassador to Afghanistan. These are people who I think will help us to change the policies that have been very detrimental over the last 30 years. But in order for all that to happen, Donald Trump has to win re-election. If he doesn't win re-election, you get Joe Biden and, of course, Kamala Harris going to the White House and going to the vice president's office. And they are going to reestablish all of the old elite establishment insider channels of power. And that's going to mean in the future, it's going to mean more wars. It's going to mean trade policies that are going to be detrimental for Americans. And they're not, it would be a mistake to think of them as free trade policies, because they're really policies that are cooked up between a certain, sort of center-left people in Washington, D.C., and then the hard-left people in Beijing. It's not something that, has Americans' interests in mind, and it's not something that has a kind of libertarian free market design in mind either. And then you'll see, of course, left-wing power in the culture continue to solidify and deepen and be used more aggressively against, for example, gun owners, against religious believers who may have views that are not acceptable to the high priests of the left. And just across the board, you're going to see a diminution of American liberties.
Among the conservative circles that you run in, is there more support for Donald Trump now than there was in 2016?
That's a good question, because on the surface there is. But in terms of the really committed Donald Trump support, I would say it's about the same. And there are a lot of people on the right who are backing Donald Trump right now who will become John McCain or Mitt Romney or George W. Bush-style Republicans again if Donald Trump loses. I would say that, the gains in terms of changing the minds of the American right have not been quite as dramatic as it might seem after 4 years in power. But I do see that there's a lot of green shoots among young people. I think there's very little interest in neoconservatism or in the more unsuccessful kinds of, squishy, conceding, and defeatist conservatism among people who are under the age of 30. I'm really encouraged by the, sort of commitment to fighting the left and, retaking the country that I see among younger people on the right.
I've been interested lately in almost a fusionism of sorts, or looking back to the Paleo-Libertarian Alliance that was back in the Buchanan days. And I've noticed when I speak with kind of national figures that are populists or or old school, the good kind of conservatives, I would call it, there's an outlook on libertarians that isn't always positive. And by that, I mean, I kind of run in the Mises Institute type libertarianism. And so I almost find myself a bit in a bubble with those like Lou Rockwell and Jeff Deist and Tom Woods and those that I consider the good libertarians. But I have noticed that some figures on the right will look at libertarianism as kind of a left-leaning libertine type group of people, or almost the Reason magazine type libertarians. In your experience, and how would you consider this, do you see libertarianism in that same way? And I should say, do you see why others might see it in that way?
Well, I can see why many people on the right have a very dim view of libertarianism in general and are not making the kind of distinctions that would make sense to apply to the various different schools of libertarian thought. And this is true of any kind of, discussion between groups of political thinkers. That it's very hard to understand the sort of fine details of a different political philosophy or of a different religion or of anyone who's engaged in a kind of different intellectual tradition than you are. And it becomes very easy just to kind of group everyone all together and say, okay, if I don't like this particular quality that this group of thinkers has, then all of those thinkers must have that quality. With regard to libertarianism, I mean, it's kind of paradoxical because on the one hand, even in DC, libertarians who are not necessarily Misesian sort of populist Rothbardian libertarians, who are very much, on the other side of things, in fact, who are kind of center-left libertarians, nevertheless, they will complain that they don't really have any power in Washington, D.C. Republicans don't listen to them. Democratic administrations don't listen to them. They're kind of on the margins and just criticizing everything. And so they don't like being blamed for the idea that they are responsible for the right's failures, or that they're responsible for, sort of squishiness and submissiveness on the part of the Republican Party. The problem is that libertarians of the center-left tend to defend a certain benign view of modern liberalism, and they see themselves as being part of it. They have a critique of it. They think it, maybe goes too far in squelching free speech or whatever. But they fundamentally agree with a progressive view that America in the past was a very bad place. America is becoming a much better place. The center-left libertarians simply see the free market as being the thing that is going to make America really perfectly good, as opposed to the state being the thing that's going to do that, which is what, sort of left-wing progressives tend to believe. So there's a very great cultural affinity between center-left libertarians and left liberals or progressive leftists. And on the right, you've got this tendency for people to emphasize their differences and to become very sort of sectarian in talking about, issues of trade or issues of immigration. So you see divisions crop up on the right as well over some of these questions, and over the basic questions of, how much of the threats facing Americans' liberties and the American order are emanating from the state and how many are emanating from the culture and from the left. And in fact, right now we're in a position where the state and the left are so closely coordinated and so deeply intertwined that you can't really oppose the state as a libertarian unless you're also opposing the left. And if you're on the right, there's this tendency to think that you can use state power now to check the power of the left, but it's actually very difficult to do that. And while I think there is something to be said for some of the nationalist policies that would be a little bit more accepting of state power than the libertarians would be, or right-wing libertarians would be, I nevertheless think that you have to be very careful in accepting the institutional premises of your opponents, and that includes the premises of what state power is able to do.
Yeah, that's very well put. I remember asking Paul Gottfried, I said something like, what do you see as more of a threat nowadays, the state or the left? And he simply, without hesitation, said, well, what's the difference? Because they're so intertwined at this point that the left seems to have incrementally gained so much power that it's like this, they want the state involved in every aspect of everyone's life so that they can control almost the culture at that point. Does that make sense to you?
It does, but they also already have such a high degree of control over the culture that they are able to instrumentalize the state. You see this, for example, with critical race theory being adopted by government agencies. So who corrupted whom there? Was it the government agencies that went out and insisted that there be such a thing as critical race theory that they could then teach? Or was it the fact that the universities were already coming up with this stuff, and then, the government decided to follow the fad because people who work in government are often coming from the same sort of university mentality, the same progressive mentality that you see inculcated in the universities. I mean, all of this becomes a complicated battlefield because you basically, it's like, you go onto a battlefield and you have various castles, various strategic points, and the left has succeeded in occupying all of them, both within the government and also outside of government. And so the question becomes, what point can the right occupy and use to fight back against this sort of overwhelming force that's coming from the left? And the fact is, the right can actually win elections occasionally. And in winning the 2016 presidential election, that was a pretty significant win for the right. And even though we found out that, winning a presidential election doesn't mean that you actually get all the power of the executive branch. In fact, it means you only get a small share of that power because then you're up against the permanent bureaucracy in the executive branch as well, which is kind of a separate, unconstitutional, extra-constitutional, and massive executive authority. The president can only do a limited amount in combat with this. Nevertheless, the limited amount that he can do can often be quite good. And I think we've seen that with Donald Trump.
What is your pitch then to, let's say, open-minded libertarians as far as why they should cast a vote for Donald Trump in this election?
Just about across the board, the things Donald Trump has actually done have been moving in a direction that libertarians of the cultural right and libertarians who are simply not left and don't want to be subjected to left-wing dominance. Donald Trump has been moving policy in directions that are favorable to those kinds of libertarians. You had a wonderful tax cut bill back in 2018, and that didn't, sort of solve the problems, the political problems of the Republican Party at the ballot box. But it was actually very significant that you got things like the elimination of the state and local taxes deduction, because what that was is a federal subsidy for higher state and local taxes. And so now, that's returned the idea that taxes should be low. Not only has it, sort of advanced that agenda on the federal level, but it's advanced it on the state level by returning this question of, hey, are your taxes too high? Are you finding yourself suffering? If so, you need to actually change your state government. You need to, change the government of the state of New York. This is not something that the federal government will kind of alleviate your pain so that the state of New York can continue taxing you, at a really high level and that you won't feel it. So that's a wonderful win in sort of two regards, both in the immediate impact in terms of lowering taxes and in the strategic impact of returning some of these questions to the states. You also see that with the various regulatory changes that the Trump administration has implemented, which either abolish regulations or return responsibility for them to states. You see in foreign policy that Donald Trump is the first president since the end of the Cold War who has not started a new war. I mean, he's really remarkable in that sense. And anyone who considers themselves anti-war or non-interventionist in any way, even if they're on the left, I would say, ought to be supporting Donald Trump in this election over Joe Biden, who, of course, was someone who actually voted for the Iraq War and someone who will bring into government, if he wins the election in November, a lot of Hillary Clinton-style internationalist and humanitarian hawks. And you're going to get, I think, a much more aggressive foreign policy under Biden-Harris than you would get with Donald Trump in office. And in fact, as I've alluded to earlier, Donald Trump is starting to make some very good personnel selections in his foreign policy choices. He's learned his lesson about people like John Bolton. I don't think we're going to see any more of that. Instead, we're going to start seeing some real non-interventionists, including some people with very strong libertarian credentials, actually, getting into influential positions in Trump's foreign policy team. And they're going to be able to restructure our foreign policy so that it's not this kind of ideological imperialism that we've been indulging in ever since the end of the Cold War. And then even in terms of things like the Supreme Court, which are often seen as being, the preserve or the sole interest of social conservatives, in fact, having originalist justices like Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court is again going to return power to the more local level. It's going to have a decentralizing effect. And it's going to be something that people who want to have self-government as opposed to being governed by, sort of centralized authorities in Washington or being governed by left-wing power that is using that centralized authority in Washington, people who want self-government and a more decentralized system are going to be continue to be very happy with President Trump's judicial appointments. So just across the board, whether it's domestic policy, foreign policy, or the effect of appointments on policy levels in the executive branch itself and on the judicial branch, Donald Trump has been just a tremendous advance for the cause of self-government, for the cause of limiting the power of the establishment, of the deep state, and of the unaccountable, grasping, domineering left.
I want to tell you guys about a great sponsor of the Death to Tyrants podcast, and that is our friends over at Zippix Toothpicks. These are flavored toothpicks. They've got several great flavors. Check these out: cinnamon, clove, mocha, and whiskey even. But not only that, each toothpick actually contains nicotine, and I use these toothpicks all of the time. Not only are they a great alternative to that nasty habit you may be trying to stop, and that includes vaping, come on now, but they taste great. They are way more socially acceptable. They are cheaper than any alternative. Hell, I don't even dip or smoke or anything like that, and I still love these Zippix toothpicks. Out of all the alternatives on the market, these are the most cost-effective, and better yet, they are a sponsor of this show. When a small business is out there helping to support one of your favorite Liberty podcasts like this one, let's thank them by returning the support. Since you are a loyal listener to the Death to Tyrants podcast, you will get 10% off of your order by entering promo code DTTP at checkout when you order over at zippixtoothpicks.com. Once again, go to zippixtoothpicks.com, that's ZIPPIX, toothpicks.com, and type in promo code DTTP for Death to Tyrants podcast at checkout, and you will get 10% off of your order, and you will be supporting Zippix and Death to Tyrants at the same time. So go do it. Let's get back to the show. I've seen a lot of infighting, naturally, amongst folks in the liberty world about who to vote for, and that this is such an important time, and should the LP try to rise above 2%, or all of these things that are always fought about. And one thing I've mentioned a few times, it seems to me that this election, and again, not to sound like my father or these boomers that have told me it's the most important election of all time throughout my years, but this one seems almost like there's parts of it that are more than just about policy. You know, like maybe fighting over free trade versus tariffs isn't particularly as important as you might have thought it once was, when there's a giant culture war brewing. And it seems to me like Donald Trump could be at least a pumping of the brakes of this leftist culture, basically trying to rule us in the world as they would see it. Does it seem at all that way to you? Like maybe it's not just specifically about policy this time?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you elect Biden-Harris, even though Biden and Harris themselves have, quite Machiavellian records when they were senators, if you elect them, what you're going to get from a Biden and Harris administration is in fact going to be a kind of blank check for the rioters and the looters and the arsonists who have been destroying our cities over the summer of 2020. And you're also going to have, of course, a great reinforcement of the power of the people who have locked down America, who have destroyed the economy, and who have in fact failed, with all these lockdowns, to prevent the ongoing spread of COVID-19 and the ongoing suffering that Americans are undergoing because of this coronavirus. I mean, think about this. All of the cities where you have massive unrest, and all of the cities, in fact, where you have claims of police abuse and claims of, unjustified homicide perpetrated by police, all of these cities are run by which party? They're not run by, Donald Trump. They're not run by the Republican Party. They're run by the Democrats. And, the idea that, okay, so we don't like what's happening in our cities, either because we don't like the police or we don't like the rioters, but either way, what's happening in our cities is a complete disaster. Now we want to reward that same political party and the people who are ideologically simpatico with the people who are ruining the cities. We're going to put those people in charge at the national level, and we're going to make them federal judges. We're going to make them federal prosecutors. And what's going to happen? You're going to see more people who defend themselves with, when rioters come to their property and they're trying to intimidate them or threatening them, and they, people come outside with their own firearms, and obviously they're not instigating this. They're saying we're going to defend ourselves. Those people who defend themselves, as we're seeing right now with a couple in St. Louis, are the ones the prosecutors are going to go after. This really is a matter not only of whether or not you have the rule of law, but whether what remains of the rule of law is going to be turned against law-abiding people, or whether it's actually going to be used to punish criminals.
Do you believe that libertarians often fight for the perfect at the expense of the good?
Well, they do, but they're not alone in that, to be fair. I think a lot of people have that same tendency. With libertarians, I think there is this need, which, again, it's not just something that applies to libertarians, but libertarians especially need to think about not only what their ideal system would look like, whether that is strict constitutionalism in the Ron Paul sense, or anarcho-capitalism, or something else. They need to think not only about that perfect goal, but also what the second best is, what you should have in the interim when you don't have the thing that you want the most. And it seems to me that there's a very big difference between the kind of interim power that you get with a Biden-Harris administration and the one that you get with a Trump-Pence administration. It also seems to me that I think, libertarians of the right can have some influence in a good way on the Trump administration, especially when it comes to things like foreign policy. And in part, the failure of libertarians to support Donald Trump in the more favorable things that he's been doing in foreign policy is what created a vacuum that was filled by people like John Bolton and the neocons. Let me say, I know a lot of sort of foreign policy experts in the D.C. area who have libertarian backgrounds who should have been in the Trump administration and who could have helped the administration, avoid having people like John Bolton in there, who could have, they could have helped make good policies and even better policies. And instead, the tendency is that a lot of these well-credentialed foreign policy libertarians, they just kind of sneer at the whole populist phenomenon. And they kind of say that Donald Trump, he's just so personally objectionable, so déclassé, so uncouth, that they want nothing to do with him. And a lot of these people are actually leaning towards Joe Biden, the guy who, again, voted for the Iraq War. And I'm afraid that when you have that kind of tendency, what you're showing is that, in fact, for all of your education and for all of your professed interest in a foreign policy of non-interventionism or a foreign policy of restraint, when it comes down to it, you actually make your decisions based on cultural feelings, and in particular, cultural feelings that are very much in affinity with the left and in affinity with people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and that are strongly, sort of considered deplorable and repugnant, the kinds of cultural tendencies and the kind of personalities that you find on the right. So libertarians are being forced, in a sense, to choose between a cultural affinity with the left and a policy affinity that is actually with the right.
Yeah, and I've often said also there is a tendency for a lot of, like I said, reason libertarians and some Cato Institute type libertarians as well to kind of reach out and kind of, at least on Twitter and verbally, and use some similar language as a lot of the left. For whatever reason, I don't actually get it myself, to feel well-liked by them or well-liked in culture, or for younger people to think that they're cool and hip and want, marijuana legalized and whatnot. But the second the people find out these people are against Obamacare, then they write them off. And so it almost seems like an exercise in futility. I've never understood the kind of outreach to want to be loved by a group of people that will really just use you and then would rather just see you silenced for the rest of eternity. Do you see that as well?
Well, I have friends at Cato and friends at Reason, and they do good work on issues like free speech very often. And again, I'm thinking of some of the Cato foreign policy people who are quite sort of solid advocates of restraint.
Yes,
but I think you're quite right that they have this tendency to, for whatever reason, they're impressed by the prestige of the left, maybe, or they are, it's simply the social groups that they have around them. And that has, an influence on kind of what's acceptable and what's not. But for one reason or another, I think they are closed-minded about the possibilities of the populist right. And they are excessively solicitous of the approval of the elite left. And the elite left, as you pointed out, really has no use for these people. Or rather, the elite left, they will invite some of these folks to a conference, or, they'll give them some op-ed space or whatever. When it comes to actually making policy, they're never going to listen to the libertarians on, issues of economics. The only thing they'll use libertarians for will be as a wedge against the right.
Right. Yeah, agreed. More of a philosophical question. Do you think that progressives have a more negative view of people than do conservatives?
No, if anything, in some ways it's the opposite. And I have to say, I think this is one of the weaknesses of libertarianism in general, and that there is a tendency, even on the libertarian right, to have an excessive optimism. And what I mean by that is there's a tendency to think that if human beings are just left alone, everything will work out fine. And, that's because you'll have the free market, or you'll have some sort of natural order that will assert itself, and you won't have to worry about corruption, and you won't have to worry about coercion. And in fact, that's not true. And I think one of the defining characteristics of, a kind of realistic right-wing outlook is that you are always going to have certain people who have a tendency to dominate and a deep desire to dominate. And you're always going to have, in the large, sort of majority of people, a failure to kind of resist heroically. People are just going to go along to get along. And sometimes people will, sort of naturally accept a certain degree of corruption. They're happy to get free stuff up to a point. And I think the libertarians make a mistake, however, when they think that democracy is to blame for this. When they think that, it's because the people have a hunger for free stuff that you have these politicians taking advantage of them. It's actually the other way around. It's politicians and people on the left who work very hard to create a lot of hungers and to take advantage of the natural weaknesses and the natural propensity for corruption, but not the natural sort of strong corruption or strong ambition for corruption that you find among the people. The people are, on the whole, better than the elite. So even though nobody is wholly good, and there is no sort of natural order that will just assert itself if you limit coercion or if you have, some other perfect system of institutions, even though all of that is utopian, nevertheless, what you have to think about fundamentally is the balance of power that actually exists and that is exerted in society, not only in government, but also in culture and also in the economy. And then you have to take into account the different ways in which different kinds of human evil are being, sort of either encouraged and multiplied through the system, or are being restrained, but they're never eliminated within the system.
Back to the election, I guess here. What effect do you see that Trump, having gotten over COVID, will have on his numbers, if at all?
It's doubtful that it will have a big effect, but I think to the extent that it has any effect at all, however marginal, it's certainly a positive one. Donald Trump, is now a living symbol of the idea that America can overcome COVID-19. And of course, 99% of the people who get it recover. And, Donald Trump is now a kind of living symbol of the idea of perseverance and not letting either fear or the virus itself cause you to sort of cower and hide in your basement.
Yeah, well put. Like I said, when I have someone like you on here, I could ask so many types of questions, so I might bounce a little bit here and there. And someone I also wanted to ask you about was Tucker Carlson, because not only do I find myself almost glued to the TV every night when he's on, he's one of the first, or at least most popular at this moment, anti-interventionist voices in media. And I thought, in 2004, if you would have said, hey, just in a few years from now, the biggest voice in news, cable news, will be on Fox News, and he will be anti-foreign intervention, I wouldn't have believed it. What does Tucker Carlson represent in this moment to you?
Well, first of all, consider the enormous courage that it takes for Tucker Carlson to do that. And I know, a lot of libertarians get offended when Tucker Carlson talks about economic nationalism and about when he's critical of capitalism and so forth. But, Tucker Carlson is the only person who kind of speaks his mind on television these days. And he's the only person who breaks with the sort of conventional wisdom, which is clearly, a conventional wisdom that is very hostile to libertarians across the board, in economics, but also in foreign policy and everything else. And Tucker Carlson's foreign policy views are authentic. He has been moving in a non-interventionist direction more and more strongly, with greater and greater momentum, for more than a decade. Tucker Carlson was interested in the Ron Paul phenomenon back in 2008. He was all the more supported in 2012. But, even back in 2008, remember, Tucker Carlson was actually the host of the Rally for the Republic that was held towards the end of the Ron Paul 2008 campaign. Mm-hmm. So Tucker Carlson is someone who, and he's done this by actually exercising his own mind. He's done this by looking at the way conventional politics works and saying, wait a minute, this is a complete disaster for our foreign policy. This is a complete disaster for ordinary Americans. We have to do something different. So he's been out there looking for what that different thing is. And he found it in Ron Paul, and now he finds it in Donald Trump, and he finds it in national conservatism. And it's fine if libertarians, disagree with some of Tucker Carlson's conclusions, but Tucker Carlson is someone you can actually talk to and actually persuade. And that is unique. And the fact that he has that persuadability, that open-mindedness, that courage to think for himself, and then not only think for himself, but to go out there and speak for himself and to change the way other Americans think, all of that is an example of a kind of heroic individualism. And it's frankly something that I think, again, one might have policy disagreements with him, one might have disagreements about, specific segments on his show, but overall, this guy is not only the MVP for national conservatives, he's someone who is absolutely indispensable for the libertarian right as well.
Yes, well put. And I've actually heard rumors over the last year or so that he's had Donald Trump's ear at any point. Have you heard that as well?
It's true to one degree or another. Let me put it that way. Sometimes it's possible that Tucker Carlson might talk to the president directly. I think the president is aware of what happens on Tucker Carlson's show. And I think a lot of the president's key personnel are also very aware of what happens on Tucker Carlson's show. And Tucker Carlson is, someone who in private is respected by these folks as well. So Tucker is just indispensable. But again, he matters for politics in that sense. He does have a certain degree of insider clout, but he also matters in terms of the American public, and especially the public that watches Fox News. And he really is changing the minds of a lot of people. What he's doing is that just as Donald Trump did in 2016, there were a lot of Republicans out there who had doubts about the global war on terror and, exporting democracy and the war in Iraq in particular. There were Republicans who had doubts about all of these things from the beginning. And sometimes they were even big supporters of the Iraq war for a time. And yet, they had the kind of inner voice of conscience or the inner voice of, more realistic perspective on the world that was telling them all of this is going a little bit too far and all of this is really going to end very badly. But they were able to ignore that inner voice as long as they were constantly hearing the pro-war message reinforced by Fox News and by pretty much all of the conservative media. And when Tucker Carlson, just like Donald Trump, started to say things that reflected what that inner voice had been telling a lot of these ordinary conservative Republicans for the longest time, they started to say, wait a minute, maybe I should be listening to my inner voice. Maybe I should be listening to my second thoughts as opposed to going along with the sort of war fever. And so there's a permanent change, I think, that is coming about on the American right, thanks to the influence of people like Tucker Carlson. And the neocons are absolutely furious about it, which is why you see the neocons are just as eager as the left to cancel Tucker Carlson, to get him off the airwaves, and to boycott all of his advertisers.
Another thing we hear every presidential election cycle is the October surprise. And here we are in October. And well, partially it's 2020. So there's about a surprise every week as far as politics and the news cycle goes. But do you foresee any big October surprises coming our way?
Well, just based on all the excitement of the past 2 weeks, I imagine that there is yet more to come. I don't think the last 2 weeks are going to be the most placid part of the campaign. So I don't know what's coming next. My guess is that the Biden administration the Biden would-be administration, the Biden campaign.
Don't scare us like that.
Created a lot. Well, we need to be scared because this is coming if we don't take action by on November 3rd. So Joe Biden, his supporters have their dossiers of opposition research, and they shop them around to all the friendly media outlets. And they plant stories. So look, it's not a coincidence that at the Democratic convention, you have all of these deep state, sort of foreign policy interventionist Republicans up on the stage of the Democratic convention endorsing Joe Biden. And then, a week later, you have the supposedly independent group of, former national security experts from Republican administrations. They send an open letter to the New York Times and all the other media outlets saying, you know what, we support, the things that we saw happening at the Democratic convention. We too, think that Joe Biden is better than Donald Trump on foreign policy. And then, a week later or later in the same week, you get a big story in The Atlantic, which is owned, of course, by Laurene Powell Jobs, who's one of the biggest financial supporters of the Biden campaign. This magazine, owned by Laurene Powell Jobs, publishes a big story claiming, Donald Trump really hates the troops. And there was this incident, 2 or 3 years ago where Donald Trump decided not to go to a cemetery in Europe and, now we have all these anonymous sources telling us that Donald Trump didn't go to the cemetery because he thought the troops buried there were losers. Well, look, I mean, it's not a coincidence that you suddenly have these anonymous sources talking about a story from 2 or 3 years ago that just happens to dovetail exactly with the supposedly independent campaign being waged by these former Republicans in the national security complex from the week before, and that too happens to echo exactly the same themes from the Democratic convention the week before that. What happens is people come together, they form, supposedly nonpartisan or non-campaign affiliated groups. Those groups then provide anonymous sourcing and anonymous information smearing the candidate they oppose. And because the media is 100% favorably disposed towards one of the candidates and 100% or 100,000% opposed to one of the other candidates, there is a lopsided representation of opposition research and anonymous sourcing in one side of the media as opposed to, in the media rather, throughout the media, the mainstream media, there's a lopsided representation of pro-Biden stories and a complete squelching of any anti-Biden stories, any criticism coming from the Donald Trump side of things.
Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. I love these guys, not just because they were our very first sponsor, but because, like I've said many times, their coffee is so damn good. If you guys like coffee that tastes the way coffee is actually supposed to taste, with natural flavors that come from the region and the roast of the beans, rather than from artificial flavorings like some other brands use, well, then you'll love Lorenzotti Coffee. If you're a real coffee drinker like myself, you don't want these weird flavors in your coffee like key lime pie or blueberry muffin. You want strong, traditional flavors that actually come from the beans themselves, and that's exactly what you get with Lorenzotti Coffee. You can get Lorenzotti's signature Venetian blend. This stuff comes right from Italy, okay? You can do whole beans, medium fine grind, which that one's actually perfect to use in the French press like I prefer. It comes in these really cool, beautifully designed, resealable tins that ship to you hermetically sealed and keep the coffee very, very fresh. Guys, I cannot speak highly enough of Lorenzotti. They're lovers of liberty. They love this show. They support this show. So why not support them by getting yourself some damn good coffee? So go to lorenzotti.coffee. That is LORENZOTTI.coffee. Guess what? We got a promo code, and that, as you know, is DTTP for Death to Tyrants Podcast. You'll get 10% off your order at checkout. Again, that's lorenzotti.coffee. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Let's get back to the show. I think one of the fascinating things about Trump, one of the many fascinating things, and something that people like yourself and myself really love, is that he's calling out, now twice that I can think of, the military-industrial complex, and I could not believe it. But then one of the frustrating things is it seems almost just like in passing he does it, like at a rally, or he did one with a fella on Fox News, like on a Sunday program. And I get frustrated and wish, yes, you're correct. Would you please say this in a much louder manner to a much broader audience? Do you think that as well?
I do, and there are rumors that a big foreign policy speech may be coming before the election. I think Donald Trump has been consistent. He always, he never says that he wants to go to war in a new place. He never says he wants to vastly, sort of increase our footprint someplace. He always says that he wants to accomplish whatever job, can be accomplished, like destroying ISIS, and then get out. And then the problem is, well, actually getting out winds up being much more difficult and having many more opponents within the administration, within the sort of military hierarchy and so forth, and within the media than Donald Trump has counted on. And instead of putting all of his political capital into accomplishing the withdrawal, Donald Trump is inclined to say, well, maybe we don't have to sacrifice everything right now in terms of our political capital. Maybe we can just sort of do this more gradually and do it over a longer span of time. And I think that is, there's a chance that can work. And I do think that you're actually seeing more and more steps in the direction of, a real reorientation of our foreign policy over the course of the Trump years. So the fact that you're now reducing the overall number of troops in Germany, some of them, yes, are moving to Poland, but in fact, not all of them, many of them are coming home. That's a significant development and a significant change. But, I think a lot of us would like to see much more change happen, especially with respect to the deployment in Afghanistan. I'm optimistic we will get that in a second term, and we'll get it sooner rather than later. But, there's a lot of other things competing for Donald Trump's attention. And even though I think his instincts are in the right place, I think, sometimes he goes along with the tendency to, avoid the tough battles that need to be fought and instead, focus on some other things that may be rhetorically very interesting, like, calling Joe Biden a socialist, but that are actually kind of less relevant for real politics.
Yes, well put. Do you feel comfortable at all? Any predictions for what might happen around the election, November 3rd?
I have just written an essay for the National Interest, and it'll be published online probably either today or tomorrow, talking about how Donald Trump can and has a very good possibility of winning the election on November 3rd. Now, having said that, my article is about the kind of unknowns out there that may favor Donald Trump. It's about some of the recent developments in the race that have favored Donald Trump. That includes his recovery from COVID-19. It includes the favorable turn of public opinion towards confirming Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And it includes, of course, the embarrassing revelations about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's connections to a corrupt Ukrainian oil company. Those things are all helpful to Donald Trump. And then there is this fundamental question of what the electorate will actually look like on November 3rd. What's the outcome what is the turnout going to be, for one thing? A lot of pollsters have been estimating a very, very large turnout, much larger than 2016. They're estimating that the turnout will be much more heavily Democratic than in the past as well. And if those assumptions are mistaken, then you're going to wind up with a very different outcome than all the conventional wisdom predicts. So I do say that Donald Trump has a path to winning. I also say that Donald Trump is the underdog, which he clearly is. And he's down in all of the national polls. He's down in pretty much all of the battleground polls. That is a big hurdle. The COVID-19 crisis would be almost fatal to any president's reelection efforts. And even if you didn't have Donald Trump with the kind of unique personality issues that are involved with him, I think this would be, the hardest reelection fight for any incumbent president in the last, sort of 50 years or so. And that, of course, includes the incumbents who lost reelection, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, for example. So Donald Trump, if he wins reelection, will have, won an even more surprising and an even greater victory than he won in 2016. And I do think that that's possible. And I do think that if, there is a very strong turnout for Donald Trump on the part of, Republicans who've had doubts, on the part of Republicans who backed him all along, on the part of a lot of ordinary Americans who just feel oppressed by the left and who feel very frightened of the consequences of what you're going to get with Biden and Harris. And even on the margins, I think it's very important that libertarians, too, say, you know what, this election really does matter. There really are material differences between Trump and Joe Biden, and Donald Trump is much better, and therefore we should vote for him. These elections will be close. Remember, a lot of the elections in the 2016 states came down to less than a 1% margin. And so you really can make a difference this time. I think you're going to see some similarly thin margins this time around as well. And so I would just say that, there are real consequences for the actions you take on November 3rd. And therefore, it's worth thinking about whether this is an example of where you should vote for something that's better and an improvement, rather than thinking about the sort of perfection you would like to obtain, even if that's sort of not obtainable by someone on the ballot this time.
Yeah, and before we get you out of here, I want you to talk about modern age. But real quick before that, a lot of my listeners are always writing me asking about what book should I read and what book should I do on this subject and what author should I look into. What books would you recommend, let's say maybe in the roots of the conservative tradition field?
Well, so George H. Nash has a big book called Conservative Intellectual Tradition Since 1945. And that's certainly a book you should pick up, as is The Conservative Mind, which was published in 1953 by Russell Kirk. And what those two books will do is they give you a bit of background as to how the post-war conservative movement kind of developed. And both books were written quite a long time ago, so they're not necessarily about the immediate concerns of today, but they're important for background knowledge. A couple of classic conservative authors who I think are particularly worth revisiting today are Wilmore Kendall, who has a book called The Conservative Affirmation, which is very, very worth reading, and James Burnham, who has a book called The Machiavellians, which unfortunately is a little hard to obtain these days. But if you can find a copy, I very highly recommend that you pick it up. There are a number of more recent books as well that I think are very interesting, including Yoram Hazony's The Virtue of Nationalism that I recommend as well. But really, I think the thing I recommend the most is subscribe to Modern Age, the journal that I edit. And every issue has some wonderful book reviews and essays that talk about the great Western intellectual tradition. And I think you will find every issue has some, book recommendations and suggestions that you will find worth taking up and, in fact, very rewarding to follow.
And how do they find out about Modern Age?
Well, we have a website, modernagejournal.com. And, the journal is published quarterly in print, so every 3 months. And then we update the website weekly. But it's primarily a print publication. And I will say that I think you want to read this in print because, it's an old-fashioned journal in terms of its layout. It is designed for readers. It's not designed for people who just want to look at pictures and graphs. It's designed for people who really enjoy the pleasure of sitting down with a book or with a serious, deep magazine and delving through it and thinking about what you're reading. And I think the pleasure that comes from that is kind of a unique experience. And it's something that, for all the advantages of the internet, it's something the internet can't quite duplicate. So I highly recommend you check it out. We do have a digital edition as well, a PDF edition. And so, if you prefer not to have print, that's an option for you. But I really do think that, you'll find the print version is non-surreal. It's really the best experience. But of course, as I say, our website is also updated regularly. We've got a very interesting, a very unusual election symposium coming up where we asked our contributors not about the 2020 election, but rather about out of all of literature, out of all of, the novels and plays and films that have been written or made in the last, 2,000 years, what fictional character do you think would make the best president? So I think that symposium with a number of interesting contributors will be delightful reading for all of your listeners.
Excellent. Daniel McCarthy, it's been a real pleasure having you on once again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm always delighted to be on.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with Daniel McCarthy. I love having him on this show. As for this show, there could be some big changes in the works. I don't want to let anything out of the bag yet, but there could be some big news very soon. It's in the works. And of course, it's good news. I'm not trying to scare anyone. It's good news. And no, it doesn't have to do with me moving. I've already done that. We will just have to wait and see. But until then, you can find all of my stuff at deathtotyrantspodcast.com. That's got the Twitter link, the Facebook page, the Patreon link, all the Instagram link even. Some of you guys are finally finding me on Instagram. And also, some of you guys are writing some really nice reviews on iTunes. I really appreciate that. You guys are really nice to write what you write. So if you haven't written anything review-wise on iTunes, feel free to do it and hit that subscribe button, of course. And I'm getting some more traffic on the YouTube page as well. Really cool. And as this episode ends, we're going to play a little clip from one of my recent Patreon episodes. So you'll hear my closing theme and then a short little clip just so it gives you a teaser as to what you can hear if you become a Patreon donor, whatever you want to call it. And I think as I tongue-tie myself out of here, that's about all I got. I will see you guys next week. Have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com. There's a lot more, and this could be because I have a podcast, so I've got more friends and co-workers and stuff like that coming up to me that I wouldn't have thought cared about this kind of stuff. But there's a lot more people probably than we realize that are at least open to hearing our side of the argument and at least as far as the culture war stuff goes, they see because the left has won all of their battles for the most part, not only through the courts, but incrementally over the years. And I think a lot of people see the giant leaps and bounds that the left is trying to take right now. And you don't have to be a Trump supporter to necessarily look at it and go, whoa, 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 this is way too much. And I think that there's a larger audience than we might have thought a few years ago that's open to our message in that light, at least.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because liberty is not mutually exclusively a right-wing or a left-wing thing. It can be applied through the whole spectrum. I mean, not if you're like a full-blown like tanky or Nazi or something like that, but you know what I mean? Like you can, like the Scott Horton rule is one way of looking at it, attack the left from the left and the right from the right kind of thing. I don't even like the word attack in that context. It's you want to try to relate to these people by speaking their own language. And at least on some historical basis, the left has been pro-liberty at some points in history, and the right claims so much to be small government and small spending. The constituents do, at least. I think that you can get these messages across regardless of how they identify on the left and right spectrum.